Hey guys, welcome back to Wheelin' with Wally. I've got a pretty good project today, and that's upgrading my brakes to this big brake kit from Blackmagic Brakes. So if you start to upgrade your tires to 35s or bigger, you can start to notice the effects in your braking. You'll start to lose a lot of your braking power, and it varies from Jeep to Jeep. Every Jeep's a little different. Mine's not too bad with 35s, but I would like a little more braking power because I've had a few sudden stops that I just made me cringe a little bit. So I've decided to upgrade to this big brake kit. So the first thing I want to say is they included instructions and what appear to be very good instructions, which I really appreciate. A lot of companies don't really do that. They either make you print your own or the instructions aren't that good. So big kudos to Blackmagic Brakes for these. Let's talk about the price real quick. I bought the whole big brake kit and I even got new ball joints separately. So I think for the big brake kit, shipping and everything, I was around $1,700. And then these were probably around $300. So altogether I have about $2,000 in brake upgrades here. And I'll go through everything and show you what we got for that. So these ball joints, like I said, I bought separately. I just picked these up off of Amazon. These are TerraFlex heavy duty ball joints. These are about $300 if I remember correctly. So this is not part of the big brake kit, but since I'm gonna be so deep inside there, I figured I might as well replace these while I have everything apart. So let's start over here. This is a large dual piston caliper that I got with the big brake kit. This is where most of your improvement's gonna come from. The regular stock TJs just have a single piston caliper, so this is gonna add a lot of braking force. And obviously you'll get two of those calipers with this purchase. You'll get two of everything else I'm about to mention. And next we have a pair of rotors. These are just nice high quality rotors. So next you get these custom knuckles that are gonna have to go on there to hold these dual piston brake calipers. Next we have two of these Timken hub assemblies. These are pre-machined from Blackmagic Brakes. You just have to take a little bit off the radius so they'll fit with this setup. So you can order them regular or kind of machine your own. You just have to grind down the edge a little bit. I just ordered the pre-machined ones for like an extra 20 or 30 bucks. And then finally you have what Blackmagic Brakes are kind of known for, and that's their Blackmagic brake pads. Now you have these just for the front. This whole setup is just for the front of the Jeep. These are, I don't really know a whole lot about brakes, but I've kind of heard them described as similar to racing brakes. These are really, really good brakes, and they have a lot of grip, but you have to season them first, and there's a whole process that's included in the instructions on how to season your brakes. So when you first put them on, you'll have to go through a process of really heating them up to get them to work correctly, and until you do that, you won't have a lot of braking force. One other thing I want to mention is if you've ever been on the Jeep TJ forums, you've probably heard the name Mr. Blaine. Mr. Blaine is the one who sells these big brake kits. He's a pretty smart and knowledgeable guy. He knows a ton about Jeep TJs, and their customer service is pretty much unmatched. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this project because I have exactly 2 weeks before I leave on a big overlanding trip to Colorado and Moab, and I really need to get this done plus a bunch of other stuff. So let's start. So the first thing we're gonna have to do is to jack up the Jeep, support it with the jack stand, and then pull the tire off. The next step is to remove the cotter pin and the castle nut from your tie rod, and then to remove your tie rod. I don't have enough room in my garage, so I'm just doing one side at a time. But if you guys had enough room, you could do both sides at the same time and just totally remove the tie rod. After you get the tie rod off, you want to move over to the caliper and remove the 2 bolts holding the caliper on. And then I'm going to use a zip tie and just kind of tie it up out of my way for now. And we'll leave the hose attached. We'll get to that in a minute. So now you can go ahead and take the rotor off. Then you have pretty good access to the unit bearing now. You have 3 bolts that hold this on and kind of a triangle, and you can reach those from the back. So we're going to go ahead and remove those. Once you have those 3 bolts out, you're going to go ahead and pull this whole thing out with the axle shaft and set it off to the side. You want to try and keep the seals and the splines clean on the axle shaft. Okay, so with the unit bearing and axle shaft removed, the next thing you need to do is remove these 2 cotter pins on the castle nuts here, and then take off the bottom castle nut all the way and loosen this one, but leave it on just a couple of threads. That way when we knock this knuckle off, That'll catch it and just kind of keep it from falling and maybe hitting your toe. Once you have the bottom castle nut off and the top one loose, you're going to want to take a, I don't know, 3 to 4 pound hammer, and you're going to want to give it a couple heavy blows on the knuckle right here on this kind of shelf, straight down, and that should pop it loose. Got that off, so now all I have to do is finish taking this castle nut off, and then I can take the knuckle off. Once you get the knuckle off and you have complete access, this is a great time to check and or change out your ball joints. I'm going to be changing mine out just because I bought these axles with these ball joints, so I don't know the age or condition. To replace the ball joints, you're going to need a little ball joint press. I just bought this one on Amazon. It's Orion Motor Tech. And then just in case, I also picked these up. These cups are made specifically for a TJ ball joint. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you're going to need some ball joints. I just picked up TerraFlex heavy duty ball joints. So I think I have it figured out with the cup set that is specifically made for a TJ. You take this big one, it goes up top, and then you take this little piece, kind of this ledged piece here, and it goes on. Then start your C-clamp like that, rest it, and then start to tighten this down until you get it nice and snug. Basically, all that's going to happen is as you tighten this, it's going to press this up and press the ball joint up into this cup. So then we should be able to just pull this up and out of there, and voila, one old used ball joint. So after you get the top one pressed, you're ready to press out the bottom one, but on mine, I have these grease zerks that are in the way, so I have to remove those before I can press it out. Now that we have those zerks out, we're ready to press the bottom ball joint out. The reason you have to press the top out first is because this spindle has to go through the hole that the top one was in. This cup is from the kit that this came with, not the separate cups that I bought. So I'm gonna put it there, put the cup down here, run the spindle through the top here. A big thing also is when you're tightening this, you don't want to crank it really hard and put a lot of torque where it's rubbing the inside of where the top ball joint goes. Kind of do your best to keep that off of there. So we're going to start by pressing in the bottom ball joint, and one of the things I'm going to do first is I have a little white lithium grease. You can use any good grease, but I'm going to take this and I'm going to just grease the inside of here some to help kind of reduce the friction as it's seating. Then the next step before we press it in is you want to pay pretty good attention to the orientation of the bottom ball joint. These two grease zerks, they need to be facing in towards the axle like this. So you got to make sure you press it in that way. So now that I've got my cups and everything all lined up, I'm going to start to crank this down and start to seat it. And once I get it seated a little bit, I'm going to back it off and make sure that those grease zerks are in the right place because I can't really see them right now. Yep, those are where we need them. So now I'm going to continue to press it in. Everything looks pressed in nicely. I'm going to check the bottom and make sure it's sitting flush all the way around right here. And it looks good. So I'm going to wipe off some of this white lithium grease and then we can press in the top one. This one, the orientation doesn't matter. The grease zerk sticks straight out of the top, so we can press this in however we want. And I'm going to start this one the same way I did the other one, and I'm going to smear some white lithium grease in here. The big thing on this one is to just make sure your holes are lined up so that ball joint can start to poke through. And then next we're going to install these grease zerks, so just screw those bad boys in there and then give them a slight tighten with a wrench or a ratchet. You don't want to crank too hard on them. And two go on the bottom and then one goes on the top. Also, now's a great time to go ahead and grease these because you got complete access to them. You can get the grease gun on there real easy. I just use red and tacky grease. You guys can use whatever high quality grease you want. I went ahead and greased mine off camera, so I'm already done. So now we're putting on the new knuckle. You're gonna slide it over the ball joint, hold it in place, and then put your castle nuts on. Once you get the nuts on there hand tight, then we need to torque them down to spec. The lower one is 80 foot-pounds, and then this one is 75 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna go ahead and torque those down with a torque wrench. So I've got my torque wrench set to 80 foot-pounds, and I've got my socket on here. It is a 15/16, and this will fit the bottom one. One more click for good luck. Now I'm gonna lower my torque wrench down to 75 foot-pounds of torque. There we are. So the top's done. And just real quick to be safe, I'm gonna recheck the bottom one. Okay. I did get a little more out of that, so that might have been a good thing to double check. Now all you have to do is put new cotter pins in there. You might have to slightly turn these a little bit more to be able to fit the cotter pin through the hole, but that's fine. So I'll do that off camera because there's not a whole lot to see. There was one thing I didn't realize that wasn't on here until I started this job, and I realized I didn't have dust shields. And while I was waiting for the ball joints to come in, I ordered new dust shields, so I'm gonna put these on as well. I'm gonna go ahead and slide the axle back in now because it'll be easier to get the unit bearing off once it's sitting up there. So I'm gonna slide this over and then slide the axle shaft in. You wanna be careful when you're sliding these in that you don't tear up your inner axle seals. So you wanna kind of guide it in and not let it drag on the bottom. So now we need to pull off this unit bearing, and it has a cotter pin that we gotta take off first. So you gotta straighten that out, then push it up and pull it out the rest of the way. Pop that little guy off, pop that little guy off, and then we gotta get a socket on that. I had to run to an auto parts store real quick to pick up a socket. I did not have one that would fit. So this nut is a 36mm. There we go, just needed a little persuasion. Set that down, and now this should come off. There we go. Alright, so there's the old one. That's all there is to it. This one I don't think was bad, but you have to chamfer the edge to fit with the new brake setup, and I just bought new ones. If I'm going to be taking this all apart, I'm putting new parts on it before this trip. Here's a new wheel bearing. This one is a Timken, and as you can see right here on the edge, it has that little chamfer that I mentioned. I bought this from Black Magic Brakes, and they just did the chamfer. Now just start putting it back together. Put that washer on. Put your little spring washer on. Put your nut on. I'm going to hand tighten this down a little bit. This nut is supposed to be tightened to 175 foot-pounds of torque. My torque wrench only goes up to I think 100. So I'm going to go with the tried and true method of just crank the living shit out of it with an impact. Then you take this little guy, stick it over the top, and then take your cotter pin. You are supposed to use new cotter pins every time, but this one's in pretty good shape and I don't have any new ones, so I'm gonna stick this one back through. And then you stick the cotter pin through, and then spread the ends. And as usual, I kind of screwed up because I put that back on without my brake dust shield. So now I have to pull the axle back out to slide this back on. So I'll do that real quick. So our next step now is to put the 3 bolts back in here that hold this all on. These will be torqued to 75 foot-pounds of torque, which my torque wrench does go to, so I will be doing. So I went ahead and hand tightened all those, and now I'm going to use the torque wrench set to 75 foot-pounds. And then just to be sure, I'm going to go back to the first side and make sure it's still tight. Yep. The next step is to put the rotor on and then clamp it in place with a couple of lug nuts. But first, it says on the box for the rotor to clean off the brushed area with some Simple Green. So I picked up some Simple Green, and I'm going to just clean off all the oils or anti-corrosion inhibitor that's on here. So now we're going to take this and put it on. So now I'm just going to run these lug nuts down to hold this in place. The next step is to put the caliper saddle on, but I have to remove the caliper to do that, so I'm going to go ahead and unbolt this real quick. Oh, there we go. Those little guys off to the side. So once you have the caliper saddle off, you have a bag with 4 bolts and some cotter pins in it. I'm going to go ahead and pull out 2 of these bolts, and you'll see they fit right in here on the caliper saddle. So I've set it up here with 1 bolt just slightly threaded in. I'm going to go ahead and take the bottom bolt, and it says to use a few drops of red Loctite, which I'm going to do. Now I'm going to stick this one in the bottom hole, and it says to crank these down to 75 foot-pounds of torque as well. Take this one back out now and put a couple drips of red Loctite on it. Now I'm going to put this bolt in. I'm still set at 75 foot-pounds of torque from earlier, so I'm going to go ahead and crank these down. Inside each caliper box, you'll have a little bag in it that has a new brake line bolt with new washers, and then those bags also have these little rattle abatement pads that you are supposed to stick on. One goes on the bottom, and then one will go on the top, both with kind of the little wing here pointing up or down, basically away from the saddle. So the top one won't stick on until we get a pad on there, but the bottom one can sit right there. So now I'm going to grab the pads and we're going to stick those on. Ow. So I've got them on. You just got to make sure you get them into those little grooves on the clips you added. And now that the pads are on there, we can finally install the caliper. So all you need to do is make sure that your bleeder valve is at the top inside of it, and then you know you're on the right side. So we're just going to stick this on. There's that. Now I just have to stick these bolts in, and they need to be tightened to 15 foot-pounds of torque. So now that the caliper is bolted on, we can move on to transferring the brake line from the old caliper to the new caliper. Mine should go right on here, no problem, but if you have the stock original style, you might have to modify the end to be able to fit here. And I have a new bolt, banjo bolt, I think that's what it's called, and new washers to go onto the new one. Take your banjo bolt, stick a washer over it, stick it through your brake line, and then take another washer and stick it on there. You're absolutely going to need to bleed your brakes after this. This needs to be torqued to 30 foot-pounds. You start at 30 foot-pounds anyway, but then if it continues to leak, you can go up in increments from there. Then the next thing I need to do is I need to take the steering stop out of my old knuckle and transfer it to the new knuckle. And it may need adjusted, we'll see. I've got my steering stop bolt pulled out, and I'm just going to screw it into the back. Okay, steering stop's in, and now I'm going to put my tie rod back on. So to do that, just take this castle nut off. I just put it back on there to protect the threads. And we're going to stick it up in here as best we can because the other side's off as well. So when I was putting the tie rod back on there, it hit me like a brick wall that I realized that I had to have my old knuckles reamed to fit this 1-ton steering that I put on there. And I panicked for a minute because my trip is like 9 days. If you count today, it's 9 days away. So I'm in a big rush to get this stuff done. And I got a little scared for a second that those needed reamed. But then I remembered I had the reamer, I just had to find it. So I found my reamer, and I really quick went ahead and reamed out both knuckles. So crisis averted there. Now I've got that on, I just need to tighten it down. Now all we have to do is tighten this castle nut to 55 foot-pounds of torque. The castle nut is blocking the holes, so I have to just crank it a little bit more so I can get a cotter pin in there. There we go. So now all I gotta do is stick a cotter pin in there and spread it. Alright, so I've got that one on there now. This side is pretty much done. I'm going to do the other side off camera. It should be exactly the same for you. But real quick, probably again off camera, I need to make sure my tire fits, make sure my rim clears all this new stuff and this double piston caliper. I finally got all the brakes on, wheels back on, brakes are bled and all that. So now I have to go break in the brake pads, and it's a kind of an intricate process. You have to do a series of 5 to 7 back-to-back normal to moderately aggressive stops from 40 miles per hour to a rolling stop without coming to a complete stop. And then after you do the first set of stops, you have to drive around at normal speeds for 10 to 15 minutes to let the pads cool down. During that time, you have to try and use the brakes as little as possible. And then if you have to stop, it wants you to do so very delicately and use the parking brake to hold yourself in place. That way you don't imprint any brake material onto the hot rotor. After you cool it down for 10 to 15 minutes, you repeat step 1 and then you repeat step 2 again. And at that point, the brakes should be good enough to drive around normally, and then you should let it cool down overnight if possible. After the overnight cool down, you'll repeat step 1 and 2 again, and then if the performance seems lacking, repeat the break-in process again. Then after step 5, drive and use the brakes normally. The stopping performance should continue to improve steadily until it finally levels off. This would be hard to film for you guys, and all it's going to be is me going up to speed and then stopping and then driving around without using my brakes as much as possible. So it'll be interesting. I suggest finding a really big empty parking lot if you know one, or I guess some empty country back roads. But you have to be really careful because you're not going to have really much braking force until you break these in. I think the front brakes are like 70% of your stopping force and the rear is 30 if I remember correctly. So without much stopping force up front, you really don't have any braking force at all. So be very careful when you're driving to wherever you're going to break this in. With all that said, guys, hopefully these brakes work out great for me in Colorado and Utah here in about 7 days now. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you guys. These brakes should be fantastic. I've only heard good things and I've had a great experience so far. If you guys aren't subscribed, please think about subscribing. I'll have some great off-roading videos coming up. You're going to have all kinds of overlanding and then badge of honor trails. Hope you guys look forward to that. I'll see you on the next one.